thank you for joining us on Go Open.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really glad to see this show starting.
Bruce, you being the primary author of the open source definition, let's start simply. What is the definition of open source?
Well, open source is not just source code. That's the most important point. It is both a program with source code that you can modify and a set of rights that come along with that program. And without the rights, the source code is useless. These include the right to use, modify, redistribute the software. And it is only those rights that give us the partnership that makes open source possible. How do you think that all of these people have come together to create, we estimate $500 million worth of code just for the Linux kernel? It is the partnership inherent in the rights that open source licensing gives you.
Bruce, you were one of the co-founders of the Open Source Initiative. And a year after co-founding it, you left the Open Source Initiative and you explained your reasons in an email titled, "It's time to talk about free software again." What were your reasons for leaving the Open Source Initiative?
Well, I have to comment first that although I've walked off that particular project, it's done just fine without me. And that's an important part about open source projects. In general, they are self-sustaining as long as people are willing to keep working on them. My problem with the Open Source Initiative as an organization, and remember this is just an organization of 6 people, is that they had come to deprecate the work of Richard Stallman, and I felt at the time we're moving away from the freedoms that I had put down as being an essential part of open source when I wrote the open source definition. Now, even the open source definition is a work of collaboration. I first proposed it as a policy of the Debian project, and then I refined it over a month with the Debian developers. Eric Raymond contacted me some 6 months later to found the Open Source Initiative. He'd had a meeting with some folks, and they said, we want to promote free software to business, but we don't want to call it free software because free in some business people's minds means shoddy, of low quality, etc. So they had decided, and Christine Peterson is actually the person who coined the name, to call it open source. Eric called me the next day, and I said, fine, I'll take the Debian free software guidelines and file off the serial numbers and call them the open source definition. And that's what we did. And all of the tenets of open source are still valid. I still support them as I support the work of Richard Stallman, who is the real genius whose shoulders we all stand upon. The only problem I had was just the means of promotion, and we've gone on just fine without me on the board of that organization.
What distinguishes free from open?
Richard Stallman feels that you should talk about freedom first and then get to practical matters, like this is great software to run your business. The open source movement is sort of the opposite, but we get to the same place. We say, let's give business people great software that helps them do their work, helps them save money to spend on things that are important to them, gives them the freedom to run their business the way they like. And then, as they get deeper into this software, they will understand that there are freedoms that are important that make this possible, and they will come to accept what Richard Stallman has to say.
Let's talk about Richard for a second. The antagonism he has towards being part of the whole open source movement and still staying in the corner of free. Why would you say is that when open source and free could be quite similarly classified?
Well, I think that Richard is very deeply concerned with the way that we talk about things. And he feels that if we say open source, that we are asking people to forget about freedom. And when Richard says free, Richard means free as in freedom, not free as in zero price. On my side of the issue, I respect Richard. I actually like him quite a lot. And I feel that my role is to be the bridge between a number of rather conservative business people in the world and Richard, who those people might at first consider a bit of a long-haired type. And thus, I sort of take a little gentle approach to those people, while Richard likes to go in and discuss philosophy first. And Richard doesn't really accept that, says he doesn't want to be associated with the open source movement, that his software isn't open source, it's free software. I think that's fine. I think it's fine to call it either one. In some ways, this is sort of like an old Monty Python movie, Life of Brian, where there was this great battle between the People's Judean Front and the People's Front for Judea. What happens is that the people who feel the most similar get into very vicious battles about small points of doctrine. And this is just characteristic of many philosophical movements. It's something that I don't feel people on the outside of those movements see as all that important compared to the people on the inside. So what I'd like to do is say, here's open source software. Try it out. It's going to be very useful for you. And once you understand that there's really something here, take a look at the works of Richard Stallman, because Richard is the giant upon whose shoulders we stand.
Now, the other side of the scale, proprietary software. Is it just well marketed? Because in many ways people say open source is more cost effective, it's better for your business, it can be customizable and better support. Why do people still go for proprietary software?
Well, there are actually three primary ways to make software for your business. The three ways that you can make software are the retail software paradigm, which is software that is produced with a capital investment by a financier or by a company which has already made some money. And then after all the work has gone into production, that software is sold, often in boxes in computer stores. And that paradigm is very good for making products for the masses, but it's only good for making products for the masses. The overheads of the retail software paradigm are extremely high. We have box design, we have marketing. We actually pay the stores to put the product on their shelves. They don't just buy it and put it on their shelves. It doesn't work that way. So the retail software paradigm has an overhead of about 90%. 10% of your software dollar goes for software development. The second major paradigm for developing software is contract development. Contract development is where you pay a programmer to make a piece of software for you. And you intend that software to be for you and not necessarily to be sold. You may employ that programmer. Of course, businesses of any size employ programmers these days. Or you may contract him as a consultant or an outside company. That is actually the way that most proprietary, and I cross my fingers when I say that, because it's not really the right word. That's the way that most software gets done. And it is very often held close in one organization. And then the third paradigm is open source. Open source is where you can start out the same way you would with contract programming, and you would then open it up to collaborators once it's useful. And what you then find is that many pieces of software are useful to more than one company. And these are pieces of software that would never work in the retail paradigm because they might not be able to build up a mass large enough to support them. And that is what open source is good for. So we take those three paradigms, the retail paradigm, the contract paradigm, and open source, and they're all good for different things. What is each good for? Well, we can divide our software into two categories for our business. We have differentiating software. Differentiating software makes your business more attractive to your customers, and it gives you some difference from your competitors. Then we have non-differentiating software. Non-differentiating software is very important because it's enabling technology for your business. Your business would not work without it, but it doesn't make your business any different from the one down the street. Now, if we look at operating systems, word processors, etc., these are all non-differentiating because everybody can get them and they all work pretty much the same. If we look at everything that Microsoft makes, everything that Microsoft makes is non-differentiating to your business because your competitor can buy it too. Everything that the open source movement makes is non-differentiating in the same way. So we take the differentiating software, the special sauce that makes our business competitive, and we do that in the contract paradigm, and we hold it close. We keep it inside our company. But that is only 10% of the software that we have or need. The rest of our software is non-differentiating, and it can be done retail, contract, or open source. I submit that open source works better because it doesn't have the huge overheads of the retail paradigm. It does not have the risk of the contract paradigm. When you do something under contract or even with your own employee, but only for yourself, you have the burden of all of the cost and all of the risk of that development. So why not go open source with your non-differentiating software? And then you share the risk and the cost with other people, even your worst competitor can be your partner on that software because it's non-differentiating.
Why is it then that the majority, I would say the majority of consumers still choose, with regards to non-differentiating software, they go the proprietary route and the more expensive route than going open source when, as you said, there aren't many differences between one or the other?
Well, let's not discount Microsoft. Although they may have done things to convince us that they're the engine of evil, they've done an adequate job of putting software in people's hands, a better job than anyone else. Okay, they were in the right place when the PC revolution started. They were in the right place to capitalize from IBM's mass marketing of the PC. And we have a sales job to do now to convince people that open source can fulfill their needs. We have, to a great extent, already done that sales job in business. Look at the web phenomenon. We are the dominant web server. Most servers are running Apache. Most of them have Linux under them. Indeed, if you even look at nonprofit projects like the Debian project, according to Netcraft, which does internet surveys, over 1 million websites have Debian systems behind them. So to a great extent, we've won this marketing thing, and people don't realize it. The next step is the home. Okay, before we really get in the home to a great extent, we have to be able to solve grandma's needs. And you know who solves grandma's needs. Every time you go over to grandma's, you fix her PC for her, right? We've got to win the hearts and minds of those people. We're a little more knowledgeable about PCs, but we're not power users sort of people. The Linux and open source world are not there yet. We have made great progress in the past couple of years with installers and ease of use, and we are getting there. So I think we'll see great strides in that area.
And by the way, I do normally have to go to my mother's house to fix her PC, so you're right there. Bruce, I want to get into the aspect of the capitalistic side of things, how open source can make money. In your opinion, how does one really make money in open source?
Well, go back to my rather long explanation of the three categories of software development and differentiating versus non-differentiating. One of the most important points there is that the major economic impact of software is the economic impact of the users of software, not the producers of software. For example, look at Amazon. They're a great example of a software-enabled business. They use tons of software. They create tons of software. They've contributed to Apache. They've contributed to other open source projects. They use Linux very extensively. However, their business is selling books, and they can afford to develop a great deal of software and share it with other companies because it's enabling software for their business. So I want to dispel one rumor here. We can support open source development without ever making a profit from anything directly connected with software. Instead, we make a profit from our open source using businesses. Whether they sell books or wash cars, they use software these days. And those are the people who have a need for open source and who, in many cases, can't get what they want, sometimes enter into collaborations on software, produce useful things, and give them to the world. So this dispels that myth. People can't afford to give the software away forever. In fact, we can, because we're making money in other ways. The question then becomes, how can Red Hat make money? How can Novell make money? This is a harder question because the open source model actually works the very worst for the software distributor, the Linux distribution, because those businesses are essentially selling a product that everyone knows they can get for free. So what do those businesses sell? Well, they'll tell you first an integration service. We make the software better. We file off the bugs, etc. We do release management. Well, that's okay, except that Debian is a nonprofit project and does that extremely well, too. And indeed, Debian is now the #2 Linux distribution. It is bigger than SUSE, at least according to Netcraft. So it's not the integration service that's going to make them money. Is it service on the software? Well, I have to say, I think that Red Hat has fallen down on the service equation so far. And in response, we've seen a number of venture capital funded startups recently whose job is to service open source, like the old Linux care. So I think that some people are still trying to make money from the service equation. And then there's what Eric Raymond used to call widget frosting, which is have a proprietary product that you sell along with your open source. And your open source is enabling for that proprietary product. Well, you know what? None of these businesses give me a great feeling. You're not going to make yourself incredibly wealthy with any one. However, you can make a living at them, a living, but not a killing. So I think we have to focus on, can we support open source from the user community rather from the Red Hats and the Novells of the world? Because if you look back, that's where open source was made. IBM came in late. Red Hat came in when Linux already was a bootable kernel. All of the rest came in later.
Some of the companies you mentioned, Novell and HP and the like, do still believe that they can make real money in what they do.
Well, HP is going to make real money because HP sells hardware. And it's easy to copy software. All of the investment in software is in the design. But when you go to material things, we don't have that Star Trek replicator yet. Captain Picard used to walk up to the wall and he would say, "Tea, Earl Grey, hot." And this cup of tea would be manufactured in front of him, and the tea would be manufactured right in the cup. And when we can make material goods that way, then Hewlett-Packard will have to look for another way to make money. But until that date, Hewlett-Packard can make lots of money because they make hardware that you can't stick in a copy machine. And for Hewlett-Packard, software has always been an enabling function. I worked for Hewlett-Packard. I was rather high up in management. I know for a fact that HP has never made money very well with software. What they did was they sold workstations in a time when workstations had 70% margins. Now, of course, the margins are lower, but their profits are coming from hardware and services. Linux is there to bring the customer to the hardware and services.
Let's talk about open source with regards to the developing world. How do you feel open source software can help countries and continents like Africa, South America, and the like?
Well, Africa, South America, and the like, for the most part, need to enable other things than software manufacturing in their economy. They have a great pool of labor who work for less today than people in Australia, than people in the United States. And through the internet, they can give a lot of those people jobs if they can educate those people sufficiently so that they can do various kinds of intellectual work. So how do we provide the infrastructure to do that? Open source software is a great way for them to do that. And what those countries need to work on is having ownership, having people in their countries who understand open source, who can put together applications with open source, and who don't depend on a Microsoft or any other company to make what Africa or China needs. With open source, you start with pieces, you glue them together, you make what you want, you modify it on the way, and you're in charge, you're in control of your destiny. So I think it's a really great solution for countries who really need a software infrastructure rather than a software manufacturing business as the primary motivator of their economies.
The way it's going, do you foresee perhaps in 5 years the end of proprietary software as we know it?
I did the wife test, and the wife test is you give your wife, who's somewhat computer literate but no geek, a piece of Linux software and see if she knows it's not Windows. So I gave her a workstation running Mozilla, and that was upstairs in my house. She had a Windows workstation downstairs, and she used it for a month. And this was not deliberate. It happened by accident. One day I went to the system and I had it in the character mode screen, something only geeks would use. And she walked over to it and said, "How do I get back to Windows?" And I looked up and said, "Well, honey, you don't have Windows." And the whole month had gone by. She'd been using Mozilla mostly. It looked just like Netscape. The start menu was where she expected it to be. Windows behaved like Windows. And that entire month had gone by. She hadn't realized she wasn't using a single Microsoft product. So I think to a great extent, we are already in the place where we can start to see these inroads. Now, unlike some people, I'm not in the business of putting proprietary software out of business. I think that there are some products that are just great for proprietary software. And in the United States, we have very complicated taxes every year. And we use a program to do them. I use one called TurboTax, and it fills out 50 pages of forms because I have a home business, etc. And TurboTax is not written for love. It's not even written by programmers. It's written by tax accountants, and it has this tremendous liability load on top of it because if you don't do your taxes well, you get a penalty from the government, and then you'll sue the TurboTax people. Well, that's a great piece of proprietary software. And there are other pieces of proprietary software which I think can remain proprietary. Another example is there's a company called Synopsys. Synopsys makes integrated circuit design software for making the next generation of microchips. Although there is open source software to do this, Synopsys is always a couple of years ahead of it and always gets you the absolute maximum capability out of the chip foundry that actually manufactures those integrated circuits. So Synopsys is selling time value. So take these two examples. Synopsys sells time value and tremendous efficiency, and TurboTax sells this incredible deep knowledge of the tax laws and the fact that they assume some degree of liability. Those are beautiful proprietary software products. Practically everything else can be open source.
Bruce, I'd like to thank you for being with us today. Taking some time out of your very busy schedule, I believe, to talk to us here at Go Open.
Thanks very much, and I wish you success with your new program.
Thank you. Bye-bye.